Elias clutched his invitation to the village ball with trembling fingers. As the only unmated Omega in Silverwood at 25, he'd grown accustomed to the sidelong glances and whispered comments. But tonight was different. Tonight was the annual celebration where couples formed and futures were decided. "You're actually going?" his younger sister Mira asked, her eyes wide with concern as she watched him prepare. "I have to," Elias replied, smoothing down the front of his simple linen shirt. "Father says it's time I stopped being so particular, that I should be grateful for any alpha who shows interest." What his father didn't understand was that no alphas had shown interest. Not since Elias had presented as an Omega with unusual traits. His scent was too subtle, his frame too tall and angular for traditional Omega beauty standards. The village healers had called him deficient, and the label had stuck. Elias had one treasure though: coat. He'd made himself from fabric he'd saved for over 3 years. Deep blue with silver embroidery along the edges. It was the one beautiful thing he owned. He'd poured his heart into every stitch, creating something that made him feel worthy, despite everything. "The coat looks beautiful," Myra said softly. Elias smiled, running his hand over the careful stitching. "Thank you. At least I'll look my best while being ignored." The village square had been transformed for the ball. Lanterns hung from trees, casting golden light over tables laden with food. Musicians played lively tunes as villagers danced and laughed. And at the center of it all stood King Alarichtha, Alpha King, who ruled their territory with wisdom and strength. Rumors had circulated for months that the king sought a mate. At 32, he was in his prime, and his visit to their humble village had sent everyone into a frenzy of preparation. Every eligible Omega had spent weeks preparing their finest clothes and practicing their most demure expressions. Elias slipped into the celebration quietly, keeping to the shadows. He watched as Omegas fluttered around the king, each more beautiful than the last. For Alaric was everything an Alpha King should beat. On broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that made everyone take notice. His dark hair was pulled back from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and piercing gray eyes. "Look, who decided to grace us with his presence," came a sneering voice. Elias turned to find Damon, the village's most prominent alpha, flanked by his usual companions. Damon had made it his personal mission to remind Elias of his place since they were children. "I was invited, same as you," Elias replied quietly, "but unlike you, I belong here," Damon said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "What's with the fancy coat? Trying to pretend you're something you're not." Heat rushed to Elias's cheeks. "Excuse me," he murmured, attempting to step around the group. Damon blocked his path. "The king's looking for a proper Omega one who can give him heirs and honor, not some defective oddity who can barely produce a scent." The words stung, but Elias had heard worse. He lifted his chin. "I'm not here for the king." "Good thing, because you'd be the last Omega he'd notice." Damon laughed, reaching out suddenly to grab Ilias's precious coat. "What is this anyway? Did you make it yourself? How pathetic." "Let go," Elias said, trying to pull away, but Damon's grip was strong. "I'm doing you a favor," Damon insisted. "If you're embarrassing yourself with this pretense." A crowd had gathered now, watching the spectacle with varying degrees of discomfort and amusement. Elias felt his chest tighten as Damon continued to pull at his coat, the stitches straining. "Please," Elias whispered, hating the tremor in his voice. "What's going on here?" A deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The circle of onlookers parted, and King Alaric stood before them, his expression unreadable. Damon immediately released Ilias's coat, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty," Damon said smoothly, "just having a bit of fun with our village oddity." Elias wanted to disappear. To have the king witness his humiliation was worse than anything he could have imagined. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to look up. "And does your fun typically involve damaging others' possessions?" the king asked, his voice deceptively calm. Damon faltered. "He doesn't belong here. Everyone knows." I don't recall asking for your assessment, Alaric interrupted. The invitation was extended to all eligible villagers. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias could feel the weight of everyone's stares. His hands trembled as he tried to straighten his coat, noticing with dismay that one of the seams had torn. "The ball continues," the king announced to the crowd. "Return to your enjoyment." As the onlookers dispersed, Elias finally gathered the courage to look up. To his shock, the king was still standing there, watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Are you all right?" Alaric asked quietly. "Yes, your majesty," Elias managed. "Thank you for your intervention." The king's gaze lingered on the torn seam of Ilias's coat. "That's beautiful workmanship." "It was," Elias said, before he could stop himself. Something flickered in the king's eyes, surprise. Perhaps at Elias's candor. "What's your name?" "Elias, your majesty." "Well, Elias," the king said, "I hope the rest of your evening improves." With that, he was gone, swept back into the crowd of admirers. Elias stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The king had noticed him, had spoken to him, but it changed nothing. He was still the rejected Omega, now with a damaged coat and fresh humiliation. As the music swelled again and couples took to the dance floor, Elias made his decision. He slipped away from the celebration, tears blurring his vision as he hurried down the path toward home. The night air felt cold against his skin, and he pulled his torn coat tighter around himself. Behind him, the sounds of laughter and music faded, a world to which he didn't belong. The morning after the ball dawned gray and misty, matching Ilias's mood perfectly. He sat by the window of his small room, needle in hand, attempting to repair the damage to his beloved coat. The torn seam was proving difficult to mend. The fabric had been stressed beyond a simple stitch repair. "You left early," Mira said, appearing in his doorway with a steaming cup of tea. "I looked for you after the dancing started." Elias sighed, setting down his needle. "It wasn't the place for me." "What happened to your coat?" she asked, noticing his repair work. "Damon happened," he replied simply. Mira's expression darkened. "That miserable excuse for an alpha. What did he do this time?" Elias recounted the previous night's events, including the king's unexpected intervention. Mira listened with wide eyes, perching on the edge of his bed. "The king himself defended you," she breathed. "Elias, that's meaningless," he finished for her. "A momentary act of decency that changes nothing about my position here." A knock at their front door interrupted their conversation. Mira went to answer it, while Elias continued his futile repair efforts. He could hear muffled voices from the main room, then Mira's quick footsteps returning. "Elias," she said, her voice strangely high, "you have a visitor." He looked up, expecting perhaps one of the few villagers who still spoke to him kindly. Instead, he found himself staring at a royal guard in full regalia. "Omega Elias," the guard said formally. "His Majesty King Alaric requests your presence at the manor house immediately." Elias blinked, certain he had misheard. "The king wants to see me." "Yes, sir. A carriage awaits outside." Mira made a small, excited sound behind him. "He must go." "Like this." Elias gestured to his simple clothes and damaged coat. "I can't appear before the king, looking so His Majesty was most insistent." The guard interrupted. He said, "To bring you as you are, with no reasonable way to refuse a royal summons." Elias found himself in an ornate carriage minutes later, clutching his damaged coat and wondering what could possibly await him. The manor house, where the king was staying during his visit to Silverwood, was the grandest building in the region, a sprawling stone structure with gardens that had once been the pride of the territory. As the carriage pulled through the gates, Ilias's anxiety mounted. Why would the king summon him? Was it to question him about Damon's behavior? Or worse, had Damon somehow twisted the events to paint Elias as the instigator? A steward met him at the entrance, leading him through corridors lined with portraits and tapestries. Elias tried not to gape at the opulence surrounding him, focusing instead on keeping his breathing steady. Finally, They reached a set of double doors. The steward knocked once, then opened them to announce, "Omega Elias, Your Majesty." The room beyond was a study, walls lined with books, and a large desk positioned before windows, overlooking the gardens. King Alaric stood by those windows, turning as Elias entered. Without the distractions of the ball, Elias was struck anew by the king's presence, the quiet authority he carried without effort. "Thank you for coming," Alaric said. Dismissing the steward with a nod, Elias bowed deeply. "I am honored by your Majesty's summons. Please sit." The king gestured to a chair near the fireplace, where a small fire burned despite the mild weather. Elias perched on the edge of the seat, his damaged coat folded carefully on his lap. The king took the chair opposite him, studying him with those penetrating gray eyes. "I've been making inquiries about you this morning," Alaric said, without preamble. Elias's stomach dropped. "I see. What I've learned troubles me greatly," the king continued. "It seems you've been subjected to considerable mistreatment in this village." "Your Majesty is too kind to concern himself with such matters," Elias replied carefully. Alaric leaned forward. "Is it true that the village healer declared you deficient when you presented?" Heat rushed to Elias's face. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Based on what evidence?" "My scent is ... subtle, and I didn't develop the typical Omega characteristics. The healer said I would likely never attract a proper mate or bear children successfully." The king's expression darkened. "And this diagnosis has followed you since?" Elias nodded, unable to meet the king's eyes. "It's just how things are, Your Majesty." "No," Alaric said firmly. "It's not just how things are, it's ignorance and cruelty, masquerading as medical opinion. Asterisk. Surprised by the vehemence in the king's voice, Elias looked up. Alaric was watching him with an intensity that made his heart race. "May I see your coat?" the king asked suddenly. Confused by the request, Elias handed over his precious garment. The king examined it carefully, fingers tracing the intricate embroidery and finding the torn seam. "You made this yourself?" he asked. "Yes, Your Majesty, over 3 years." "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Alaric said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I've seen royal seamstresses produce work of lesser quality." Elias blinked, unprepared for the compliment. "Thank you. Would you permit me to have it repaired? I have a tailor who could restore it perfectly." "That's very generous, but I insist," Alaric said, his tone gentle but firm. "Consider it my apology for what happened at the ball. I should have intervened sooner." Before Elias could respond, the king rose and pulled a cord near the fireplace. A servant appeared almost instantly. "Take this to Master Thorn," Alaric instructed, carefully handing over Elias's coat. "Tell him it's to be repaired with the utmost care and priority." As the servant departed with his coat, Elias felt strangely vulnerable. That coat had been his armor, his one beautiful possession in a world that found him lacking. "It will be returned to you by this evening," the king assured him, seeming to sense his discomfort. "In the meantime, I have a proposition for you." "A proposition?" Your Majesty. Alaric returned to his seat. "I'm establishing a new royal workshop for fine textiles and embroidery. Based on what I've seen of your work, I believe you would be an asset to such an endeavor." Elias stared at him in disbelief. "You're offering me a position?" "I am. It would mean relocating to the capital, of course. You would have quarters in the palace, materials of the finest quality, and fair compensation for your work." The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything Elias could have imagined, that he found himself speechless. To leave Silverwood, to escape the whispers and judgment, to work with fine materials in the royal palace, it seemed like a dream. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. "Why would you do this for me?" Something shifted in the king's expression, softening around the eyes, a slight curve of his lips. "Because talent should be nurtured, not crushed. Because no one should be made to feel less than they are, based on ignorant prejudice." There was more to it than that. Elias could sense it, in the way the king looked at him, in the careful attention he paid to Elias's words. But he couldn't fathom what it might be. I don't know what to say, Elias admitted. Say yes, Alaric replied simply. Say you'll come to the capital and create beautiful things without the weight of this village's judgment on your shoulders. In that moment, looking into the king's earnest gray eyes, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for escape, but for a future where he might be valued for his skills rather than dismissed for his differences. Yes, he said softly, I would be honored to accept your Majesty's generous offer. The smile that spread across Alaric's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Excellent. We depart in 3 days. That should give you time to make arrangements. As Elias left the manor house later that afternoon, his mind whirled with possibilities. The king's tailor had already sent word that the coat would be ready by evening, and Alaric had insisted on sending it to Ilias's home personally. For the first time in years, Elias walked through the village with his head held high. The weight of rejection temporarily lifted from his shoulders. Change was coming, change he had never dared to hope for. And it had all begun with a torn coat and an alpha king who saw beyond the labels others had placed upon him. 6 months passed like a dream for Elias. The royal workshop became his sanctuary, a place where his talents flourished under the appreciation of those who valued craftsmanship above all else. His quarters in the east wing of the palace were more luxurious than anything he could have imagined: a sitting room, bedroom, and private workspace, filled with natural light and the finest materials. What surprised him most, however, was the king's continued interest in his work and well-being. Alaric visited the workshop regularly, often lingering by Elias's table to discuss his latest projects. These conversations gradually extended beyond embroidery to books they had both read, music they enjoyed, and eventually, more personal matters. You seem happier, Mira observed during her first visit to the capital. Elias had arranged for her to join him once he was settled, unwilling to leave his sister behind in Silverwood. I am, Elias admitted, showing her around his workspace. Here, no one calls me deficient or odd. My work speaks for itself. And the king? Mira asked, with a knowing smile. He speaks with you, often, I hear. Elias felt heat rise to his cheeks. His Majesty is kind to all his subjects. Not all his subjects receive personal invitations to dine in his private gardens, she countered. It was true. Over the past months, Alaric had invited Elias to share meals with him with increasing frequency. What began as formal discussions about workshop matters evolved into intimate conversations that often lasted well into the evening. During these times, Elias discovered a different side to the king, a man with a dry sense of humor, a passion for history, and a deep commitment to his people. We're friends, Elias said carefully. Nothing more. Mira raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. The court gossips differently. The court did indeed gossip. Whispers followed Elias through the palace corridors, speculation about his relationship with the king, questions about his background, and most persistently, doubts about his worthiness as an Omega. The old insecurities sometimes threatened to resurface, but Elias found them easier to dismiss with each passing day. On a crisp autumn evening, Elias was summoned to the king's study. He arrived to find Alaric pacing before the fireplace, an unusual tension in his shoulders. Your Majesty, Elias greeted with a bow. You wanted to see me. Alaric turned, his expression softening immediately. Elias. Yes, thank you for coming. He gestured to the familiar chairs by the fire. Please, sit. Once they were seated, Alaric leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. The council has been pressuring me to announce my choice of mate. Ilias's heart constricted painfully. He had known this day would come, had prepared himself for it, but the reality still felt like a physical blow. I see. Have you made your selection then? That's what I wanted to discuss with you, Alaric said, his gray eyes intense. The council has presented me with a list of suitable candidates, all from noble families, all with impeccable Omega qualities. All worthy of a king, Elias added quietly. On paper, perhaps. Alaric rose suddenly, moving to stand by the window. But I find myself, reluctant. Elias remained silent, unsure what response was expected of him. After a moment, Alaric continued. Do you know why I came to Silverwood 6 months ago? To find a mate, I assumed. The rumor said, I came because I was tired, Alaric interrupted. Tired of court politics. Tired of Omegas who wanted my crown more than they wanted me. I thought a rural village might offer something authentic. He turned back to face Elias. And then I saw you at the ball, standing apart, wearing that remarkable coat you'd made yourself. When Damon confronted you, I expected you to cower or plead. Instead, you faced him with dignity, even knowing you stood alone. Elias remembered that night. Vividly, the humiliation, the torn coat, and the unexpected intervention of the king. You were kind to me. It wasn't kindness, Alaric said firmly. It was respect. And later, when I learned how you'd been treated labeled deficient, for not conforming to some arbitrary standard of what an Omega should be, I was furious. He crossed the room to kneel before Elias's chair, a gesture so unexpected that Elias gasped. Your Majesty, what are you? I brought you to the capital under the pretense of your talent. Which is genuine and extraordinary, Alaric said, taking Elias's hands in his. But the truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you in that village. I wanted to know you, Elias, to understand the person who could endure such treatment and still create something as beautiful as that coat. Elias's heart pounded so loudly, he was certain Alaric must hear it. And now that you know me, now I find myself facing a choice between what is expected of me and what my heart desires, Alaric said softly. The council wants me to choose a traditional Omega from a powerful family, someone who will strengthen political alliances and produce heirs without complication. A reasonable expectation for a king, Elias managed to say, though the words felt like glass in his throat. Perhaps, but I want you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Elias stared at Alaric, certain he had misheard. What did you say? I want you, Elias, not as my royal embroiderer, not as my friend, but as my mate. My equal, my Omega. But I'm, if you say, deficient, I may have to issue a royal decree, banning the word, Alaric said, with a hint of his usual humor. You are extraordinary, different, yes, but in all the ways that matter to me. Elias shook his head, overwhelmed. The council will never accept me. The court already whispers that I've enchanted you somehow. They'll say, you're throwing away your duty for an Omega who may not even be able to give you heirs. Let them whisper, Alaric said fiercely. As for heirs, there are many ways to build a family, and the council serves me, not the other way around. He reached up to cup Elias's face gently. I'm not asking you to decide this moment. I know what I'm proposing would change your life irrevocably. There would be scrutiny, criticism, perhaps even danger, but there would also be me, loving you every day, standing beside you against anyone who dared question your worth. Tears welled in Elias's eyes. Why me, of all the Omegas in your kingdom? Because you see me, Alaric said simply. Not the crown, not the power, but me. Because, when we talk, I feel understood for perhaps the first time in my life. Because your scent, subtle as it may be, calls to something deep within me that I never knew existed. He pressed a gentle kiss to Elias's palm. Think about it. That's all I ask. For 3 days, Elias thought of little else. He wandered the palace gardens, seeking clarity in the autumn blooms. He visited the library, hoping the wisdom of ancient texts might offer guidance. He even sought out Myra, who listened to his conflicted thoughts with patient understanding. You love him, she said finally. That much is clear. The question is whether you're brave enough to face what comes with loving a king. On the 4th day, Elias made his decision. He sent a message to Alaric, requesting a private audience, and received an immediate response. That evening, he made his way to the king's private gardens, where they had shared so many meaningful conversations. Alaric was waiting by the fountain, tension evident in every line of his body. When he saw Elias, hope and fear warred in his expression. "You've decided?" Elias nodded, coming to stand before him. "I have." "Before you tell me," Alaric said quickly, "I want you to know that whatever your answer, your position here is secure." "I would never." "I love you," Elias interrupted softly. "I think I have since that night in Silverwood, when you defended a stranger simply because it was right. I've fallen more deeply in love with you every day, since with your kindness, your intelligence, your dedication to your people." Alaric's breath caught. "Elias, I'm terrified of what it means to be your mate," Elias continued. "Of the scrutiny, the expectations, the inevitable disappointment when people realize their king has chosen someone like me. But I'm more terrified of walking away from this, from you because of fear." He took Alaric's hands in his. "If you truly want me, if you're willing to face whatever comes with that choice, then yes." "My answer is yes." The joy that transformed Alaric's face was like nothing Elias had ever seen. The king pulled him close, one hand cradling the back of his head as their foreheads touched. "I have never wanted anything more in my life," he whispered. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Alaric kept Elias close in his arms. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The council will fight this. The court will gossip. Some of my allies may become enemies, and some of your enemies may become allies," Elias countered. "Those who have felt excluded or different may see hope in our union." Alaric smiled. "Already thinking like a royal consort." "I'm thinking like someone who knows what it means to be judged and found wanting," Elias corrected gently. "Perhaps that perspective has value in a royal court." "Immeasurable value," Alaric agreed. "We will change things, you and I, not overnight, but gradually, persistently, beginning with that absurd classification system that labels omegas as deficient for not fitting a narrow mold." The announcement of their engagement a week later sent shockwaves through the kingdom. As predicted, the council objected strenuously, citing tradition, political alliances, and thinly veiled concerns about Ilias's suitability as a royal consort. Alaric met each objection with calm determination. "My choice is made," he told them during a particularly heated session. "Elias will be my mate and your future king consort. You may advise me on how best to prepare him for this role, but you will not question his worthiness to fill it." The court adapted more quickly than expected. Some nobles, particularly those with children who didn't fit traditional designations, expressed quiet support. Others maintained a careful neutrality, waiting to see which way the political winds would blow. A few made their disapproval known through cold shoulders and whispered comments. Through it all, Elias worked to prove himself worthy of the position he would soon hold. He studied protocol and history, familiarized himself with the kingdom's political alliances, and continued his work in the royal workshop, now designing ceremonial garments for his own mating ceremony. "Are you nervous?" Mira asked the night before the ceremony, helping him with final adjustments to his ceremonial attire. "Terrified," Elias admitted, "but not of marrying Alaric. Never that." "Then what?" He gestured to the window, beyond which lay the capital city, and the kingdom beyond. "For failing them, of not being what they need in a royal consort." Myra squeezed his hand. "You'll be exactly what they need. Someone who understands struggle, who values compassion over convention, who sees people for who they are rather than what designation they carry." The mating ceremony the next day was unlike any in the kingdom's history. Traditionally, royal omegas were presented to their alpha mates, a symbol of the union of houses. Alaric insisted instead that they walk to the ceremonial dais together, equals from the start. And as they exchanged vows before the assembled nobility and representatives from across the kingdom, Elias wore his blue coat, the same one that had been torn that night, now meticulously repaired and embellished with gold thread that caught the light like stars. A reminder, Alaric had said when he suggested it, of where our story began, and proof that damaged things can be made whole again, more beautiful than before. Their union became known as the love that made history, not just for breaking with tradition, but for the changes that followed. Under their joint leadership, the kingdom reformed its designation system, recognizing the spectrum of alpha and omega traits rather than rigid categories. They established schools where all children could develop their talents regardless of designation, and they welcomed into their court those who had previously been marginalized for being different. And when, against all expectations, Elias did conceive a child 2 years into their marriage, they celebrated privately. First, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, creating a family and a legacy that would endure long after them. The rejected Omega and the Alpha King, who saw his true worth, had rewritten not just their own story, but their kingdom's future. 5 years after their mating ceremony, the royal family gathered on the palace balcony, overlooking the central square. Princess Lyra, their 4-year-old daughter, tugged at Ilias's hand. "Papa, I made this for you." She proudly presented a crown woven from wildflowers and ribbons. Elias knelt, allowing her to place it on his head. "It's beautiful, little star. You look pretty," she declared. "But something's missing." Alaric appeared with their 2-year-old son, Theo. His eyes softened at the sight of his mate wearing their daughter's creation. "Indeed, something is missing." From his pocket, the king produced a delicate silver circlet, studded with blue gems that matched Ilias's ceremonial coat. He placed it gently atop the flower crown. "5 years ago, you wore a coat that told me everything about your heart," Alaric said softly. "Today, you wear a crown that tells our kingdom everything about mine." Before the gathered citizens, Elias addressed the crowd, the dual crown catching sunlight as he spoke. "My journey from rejected Omega to king consort began with a torn coat and an Alpha King who saw beyond labels. That coat now hangs in the Royal Museum as a reminder that damaged things can be mended, that rejected things can become treasured." He lifted Lyra into his arms, while Alaric held Theo. "This is our Ligutia kingdom, where no one is labeled deficient for being different, where coats can become crowns, and where love makes history every day." That evening, alone in their chambers, they stood before the preserved blue coat that had started everything. "From village outcast to beloved consort," Elias whispered, tracing the nearly invisible mended seam. "From lonely king to complete man," Alaric replied, drawing him close, as moonlight bathed them in silver light. Elias rested his head against his Alpha's chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had recognized his worth when no one else could see it, the heart that had transformed a simple coat into a crown of love that would inspire their kingdom for generations to come.